Good day, philosophers. So as we just been discussing, Socrates has a challenge ahead of him. A challenge to not only say what justice is, but to try to defend how justice could be something that's good for its own sake. What do most people think? As Glaucon's story of the Ring of Gyges tells us, most people don't really want to be just. We already kind of knew that, but most people are only just because they're afraid of the punishments and the consequences that come from acting unjustly. And so they choose justice mostly out of fear. Right. However, Socrates says that even in face of fear, that justice is good for itself and worth choosing, even if it means suffering. So we will now finally get Socrates' account of what justice is and in what sense it ultimately helps him see that it's something that you need to choose for its own sake, regardless of what someone might do from outside of you. Okay? And so what is this view of justice? Well, we'll see that he ultimately sets this up, again, as I said, in a way that I ultimately don't find completely satisfying as a philosopher, because it's mostly analogy. I would really just like some really beautiful, crisp, clear statements. But, Socrates never really gives us exactly what we want, right? And so in Book 2 of the Republic, we see here around line 369a approximately, we see Socrates ultimately tell us how he's going to help us figure out what justice is, right? And he says to Adeimantus, perhaps then there will be more justice in the larger thing. It'll be easier to discern. More justice in the larger thing? What the heck is he talking about? So if you're willing, let's first find out what sort of thing justice is in cities, and afterward look for it in the individual to see if the larger entity is similar in form to the smaller one. Okay. So what we need to do is, in order to understand justice, we need to first look at justice in a city and then turn to try to understand justice in the soul. Okay. All right. Thank you, Socrates. But there's something important here. This actually points to something that I already brought up in the last 2 lectures or so, that when we think about justice, then he wants us to think about it in 2 domains of our lives. First, he wants us to think about it in terms of what we've already said, that Thrasymachus' definition of justice said it's ultimately obeying the rulers, what's advantageous to the stronger. And that is a very public, ultimately a political sense of justice, right? And that is an important sense of justice we need to consider. But if we're really going to see justice as good in its own sake as well, too, we also need to consider justice within ourselves as a person, as he'll say, within our soul. And this is a more internal and definitely an ethical sense of justice. Now, a quick aside, when Socrates talks about the soul, I just want to point out very quickly that Socrates does not mean by the soul the same thing that we sort of mean by the soul today. When you use the word soul, we inherently think of it as something that's some type of spiritual appendage to ourselves that somehow like is something that we could barter with the devil. Like you hear people say they sold their soul to the devil, right? Or it's like this interesting kind of spiritual part of ourselves. For Socrates and the Greeks, arguably there's a spiritual dimension to lots of things, but it's not so spiritual in that sense. To have, in fact, almost lots of, let me put it this way, lots and lots of things have souls for the Greeks, and it's not just humans. Why? Because to have a soul for them means to be alive. Do you ever hear the phrase, something that's like an inanimate object? Something is animated or inanimate. Well, to be inanimate means to be not alive, or not even something that could be capable of life. But an animated thing would be something that is alive. And anima means the soul, right? There's a great book by Aristotle called De Anima, and De Anima is all about the soul. And what is it about? It's about that which gives us life. And so when you think of the soul, it's ultimately the principle of that gives life to a person, right? And so for the Greeks, that doesn't necessarily have the same type of spiritual and religious connotations that it does for us today. So let's just bear that in mind, because we don't need to attribute so much to the soul. What does he mean by the soul? Well, actually, let's start with the city, and then we'll talk about the soul and see the different parts of the soul that Socrates thinks exist, and we'll see why that has to do with soul. Okay, so in order to understand justice in the city, Socrates, we're not going to really even take this up until book 4. We skip reading most of, entirety of book 3. And we picked up in book 4. And in book 4 is where Socrates actually lays out this analogy looking at a city and a soul. And he says, in a city, there's essentially 3 parts. There's three things that make up the city. Now, when you think of cities, you might think of like skyscrapers and infrastructure and all that. That is not what Socrates is thinking about. What really makes a city is its inhabitants, its people. If there's no people, there's no city. If you had even a beautiful infrastructure and tall buildings, but no one lived there, that wouldn't be a city anymore, even for us, right? And so when Socrates thinks about the 3 parts of a city, he's ultimately thinking about what are the 3 general sort of classes of people. Now, this is, again, not supposed to be classes in terms of like who has the most versus who has the least. It's like 3 different roles people play within a city. And he says, first of all, there are, the rulers. Okay, there's whoever is the lead governmental structure. Then there's who he calls the guardians. And which in certain translations also are called the auxiliaries. And then finally, there are the craftsmen. Now, when we think of these 3 things, it's kind of peculiar, right? I mean, the rulers make sense, and craftsmen sort of, I guess, kind of make sense. And the guardians, they're sort of like the police force and things like that. But you have to have, so you got to have like some key ruler here, then you got to have guardians, and the ruler doesn't have to be just one person. He actually, in Plato's Republic, he does examine 6 different forms of government and criticizes them in various ways. I won't get into. Sadly, that's something that we'll also sort of skip for our course. And then there's the craftsmen right here, right? And so you've got these 3 parts of the city, right? And now let's think about ourselves really quick. Where do you think we fit in as human beings, right? What are we today? Well, I'm not a ruler and I'm not a guardian, so I guess I'm a craftsman. But that doesn't sound right, because actually I do. I like to build stuff out of wood, but I don't really make my life that way. I don't contribute to society by doing those crafts. Do I have a craft? And the answer is actually yes. When Socrates is talking about craftsmen, he actually means something much broader than the way that we use the word. So the craftsmen are people who ultimately practice a craft or provide some service for society in general, right? And so that can be like the traditional crafts that we think of, but it also includes things like teachers and doctors and engineers and all kinds of stuff, right? That in fact, the vast majority of us are craftsmen. And so what does Socrates say when he looks at a city? He says, okay, you've got these 3 parts. And now we need to think about what's most important for us to get right. If we want to make sure we have the right people fulfilling the right jobs, Socrates is going to say, well, quite obviously, maybe in his mind, is that the most important thing for us to find is the right person to be the ruler. We need the right rulers for us. And what makes a ruler a good ruler? Well, it actually ends up sounding a lot like a philosopher. And if that's another part of the Republic we won't fully explore. But as it turns out, what do we need for a good ruler? We need someone who would be wise, someone like a philosopher, a lover of wisdom, right? Shocker. This wise ruler would help order the whole city to make it good. Now, Socrates also wonders what would happen if life was ruled by craftsmen. Well, inherently for him, craftsmen seek their own good. And not in a bad sense. It is good for a craftsman to seek their own good, but they need to do it in context with everyone else. So for instance, even myself as a teacher, in fulfilling my role as a teacher, I seek the good of being a teacher, right? So I look out for things that would be good for me as a teacher and teachers in general, but I'm also a father in some sense, right? And I look out for things that are good for my family. And it's important for me to look out for the good of my family. Who else is going to care for my children if not for me? I need to look out for my children more than I look out for anyone else. It is my number one role as a father to care for my family and seek their good, most importantly. But I also have to do it in context of a community. Right? And so part of having a strong and the right wise ruler is to help keep everything else in order, to help make sure that the craftsmen seek their own good, but in a way that's consistent with the good of the whole. All right, well, we'll come back to that in just a second. So that's just a fundamental idea there. So we've got the rulers, we got the guardians, we got the craftsmen. Now, what are we talking about with the soul? All right, so in a soul, there we could say that there is, well, once again, 3 parts. And which part of the soul is most like the ruler? Well, for Plato, that would be the rationally deliberating part of our soul, sort of like our reason. Okay, so we have reason, and that rules us. And now, then he says that there's another part of our soul that he calls this let me get my thing to move, the spirited part, which is like our passions. And that is like our anger and our excitement and things like that. And actually, those are going to be interestingly kind of analogous to the guardians. And then finally, like the craftsmen, are our appetites, are our desires. And those are the 3 parts of the soul. Now, this is not very good biology, but not at all. But if you take any individual that exists, right? Any person, any craftsman, any ruler, any guardian, you take a person and you look inside them. Socrates says that essentially there's these 3 parts within them. There's the rationally deliberating, which is associated in Greece with the head. That doesn't shocker. So here's this sort of rational part of you, right? And then there's the spirited part, the passionate part of you, the anger, the part that feels anger and things like that. And that in Greek is like considered the chest, right? That's this part of you here. And then finally, there's your desires, your appetites. And as you might imagine, that's a little bit lower. That's here in your stomach, right? And sometimes slightly below your stomach as well, too. That's your appetites and desires. Now, when Socrates looks at a city and he looks at the soul, he ultimately says that they are connected, right? That they are analogous, that the craftsmen, that all of us here are like our stomachs, right? That craftsmen tend to, like our appetites and desires, seek their own fulfillment, seek to just be satisfied, right? The guardians are like our chest, our spirited part, our desires. They not our desires, our passions. And so we have here our chest, that spirited part, and our rational part is like our ruler. Now, just like it's incredibly important for us to find a wise person to rule the city, Socrates says it's incredibly important for us to have a wise person running our brain. Well, kind of true. That what he means there is that we need to get our heads right. We need to be governed by our rationally deliberating part. And that rationally deliberating part needs to be well informed. Our rationally deliberating part needs, what do you think? Wisdom. We need to understand what's actually good within ourselves so that we can order ourselves rightly. Because here's one of these things. You could think about it for a second. You could actually be, just like we can imagine what life would be like if it was governed by the craftsmen. Socrates is a little bit nervous about that because these people are only he's in his mind, in his depiction of us in general, is the many tend to look only out for their own good. And they're only going to support laws that support their own good. Just like the appetitive part. So let's think within ourselves. What would life be like if you were governed only by your appetites and desires? What would life be like for you? Well, that would be like being an addict almost, right? Where I'd say, man, I want this, so I immediately go out and try to get it. And that's how I spend my life. And even if I was governed by my appetites, then even my reasoning would have to obey my appetite at any given moment. Like right now, why am I even sitting here recording this video? I haven't eaten in like hours and I'm hungry and I haven't had coffee in a while. Maybe that's why my tongue's getting tied a couple of times here. I want to go, I'm gone. No, like if you were truly governed by your appetites, you would be incapable of really doing anything as a person, right? What if you were governed by your passions? For Plato, this would be analogous to be governed by the guardians. Well, he said that would also be potentially disastrous, because if you're governed by your passions, then you're governed by your anger, you're governed by your excitement. It's not you realizing what's actually good and being motivated by that, but it's just getting excited. And so when you think about that, you could think of like cheerleaders and things like that, or politicians who get people riled up, who get people spirited. And that's a good thing, but it's the spiritedness that shouldn't really determine what's good and what's right about what we can get excited about. It's about what actually is good and what actually is right. We should get excited by what's truly good, but it's also possible, just like we know our sophist friends, remember the sophists who could convince and persuade people of anything. We could get excited and passionate about things that aren't ultimately the good that our reason could discover. And so for us, within ourselves, it's important that, number one, we're not governed by our appetites and desires. We're not governed by our passions, that we're governed by a reason, but not just any old reason, a reason that cedes its authority to the other parts, but a reason that's governed by an understanding of the things that matter the most. And so what Socrates does first is he's walking around the city of Athens, challenging people to try to get to true knowledge of things that matter, first for the person's own good, so that they can be governed within themselves correctly by their reasoning, and that their reason will lead them towards what's actually good, so that someone can seek what they want, but what they want will actually give them what they want. That's internal harmony and happiness within themselves. Analogously, when we look at the city as a whole, it would also be good for us to have a city that's correctly ordered, a city that's run by a ruler, but not just any old ruler, a ruler who is wise, who understands things, not just the things in ethical sense about what should be done within themselves, but in a political sense about what should be done for the community as a whole. A wise ruler who understands, well, bring all the other parts and make them better. Just like an excellent reason, Plato argues, someone who has a well-governed person by the reason, they will order their desires. They will help their appetites desire exactly the right things at the right time. Their spirited part, they will lead themselves to be passionate and angry about the things that matter at the right time. In the same way, a great ruler in the city will lead the guardians and the craftsmen to be excellent at the same time. So for him, what is justice? Justice is the right ordering of the city, the right ordering of the soul, a right ordering that comes about when you embrace and you are ruled by wisdom. And so we see here that Socrates, again, has this is a kind of cutesy, analogous, metaphorical way of talking about justice. He says, justice says that everything needs to be governed by wisdom. Justice is doing one's own work, and when each part does its own work. That doesn't sound very satisfying, but what he's ultimately saying there is that when each part ultimately does what it does, and it does it well, and it's only capable of doing that when a person is fundamentally led by wisdom, right? And so this is what we ultimately need to seek. We're going to take a look at just a couple of texts now. We've read woefully little from the Republic throughout this entire discussion, which makes me a little bit sad. So let's read a couple of texts here to close out this lecture and this week. We're going here to Book 4 of the Republic, and I'm just going to read a couple lines. This is the very end of Book 4, and here on page 132 in our translation, marginal lines, I forget the numbers here, about 443 D approximately. Here we'll read together. And Socrates says, "And in truth, justice is, it seems, something of this sort. Yet it is not concerned with someone's doing his own job on the outside. On the contrary, it's concerned with what is inside, with himself really, and the things that are his own. means that he does not allow the elements in him each to do the job of some other, or the three sorts of elements in his soul to meddle with one another. Instead, he regulates well what is really his own, rules himself, puts himself in order, becomes his own friend. Let's just pause there for a second. And to me, that is a really nice line that shows what Socrates is really talking about here, that Socrates thinks that in looking at justice in this way, we actually become our own friends in a way that we weren't before. You could very easily become your own enemy. I wonder how many times you found yourself becoming your own enemy in life, right? But Socrates says that justice in the soul is becoming your own friend. That you look out for your own good. And how do you know who your friends are? Your friends are people that you want the good for them, and they want the good for you. And so he thinks you need to become your own friend, and that's what justice in the soul does. Let me continue. So in becoming your own friend, he says, and harmonizes the three elements together just as if they were literally the three defining notes of an octave: lowest, highest, and middle, as well as any others that may be in between. This is great. He binds together all of these, and from having been many, becomes entirely one. That theme of the one and the many comes up here again. That having been many, you become entirely one. So that is what justice does within ourselves and within a city. Out of many, one. Isn't that what we say, e pluribus unum, in America? That out of the manyness that we can become one. Justice in the city is a kind of oneness. Now, we are frustrated with the lack of justice in America today. And I think the lack of oneness, there is so little oneness in America today. All there is otherness. I don't know if you guys ever were fans of the show Lost. I really enjoyed the show Lost. I saw it from the premiere and watched every episode live. I was kind of geeky that way, and that also tells you about my age. But there were these people. Eventually, you might see them by end of season 1, season 2. You encounter the others, right? And the other, and that's that sense of always there's us versus them. There is no unity. Well, what Socrates says is that justice in the city, when you have wisdom guiding and leading all the parts, you can have a city that is truly one. But you also need to have oneness in your own soul. And the only way to have oneness in your soul is by establishing justice there, by allowing wisdom to guide you, not be guided by by you just going for whatever you want, but realizing what you want isn't often what you want. You need to seek what is truly good for yourself, right? And so this is ultimately your health, right? He says, another nice line here. He's talking about justice. He says that they do not differ in any way from healthy actions and unhealthy ones, that what the latter are in the body, they are in the soul. So he says acting justly is like the health of the soul, right? And so fundamentally, that if you seek to live an unjust life, if you, like the many, according to Socrates, and I look inside myself and I see it, right? I see it inside myself. I realize that that there are times when I don't act the way that I say I would act, that I am a hypocrite, that I go against things that I even believe in my own life. We do these things, and that I am very much like the many. But that being like the many in that sense actually shows a depravity within myself that is ultimately my own unhealth, that I am ultimately destroying myself by simply seeking what I desire over what is actually good. But instead of looking for what's good and seeking in wisdom and obeying wisdom, just obeying my appetites, right? And so when we see another beautiful line here, when Glaucon is summarizing so many of the things that Socrates says here around line 445 B approximately says, but Socrates, that question seems to me at least to have become ridiculous now that the two have been shown to be as we've described. Life does not seem worth living when the body's natural condition is ruined, not even if one has food and drink of every sort, all the money in the world, and every political office imaginable. Whew, whew, this is interesting, right? So how, even if one could do whatever one wished, except what would liberate oneself from vice and injustice and make one acquire justice and virtue, could it be worth living when the natural constitution of the very thing by which we live is ruined and in turmoil? Right? He ultimately says that that life, even with everything that we could possibly have, would not be worth living if we don't have justice in our soul, because all the wealth, all of the power, all of the ability to get away with whatever you want is never going to do anything for you if you are sowing discord within yourself by not obeying wisdom. That's Socrates' view. So, my friends, that essentially ends this module for us, that we see Socrates willing to die for the sake of living a just life, takes it incredibly seriously for us. And we see that is how he sets a standard for us as philosophers. He says that philosophy matters, not just as an academic pursuit, but as something that is fundamentally connected to me as an individual being able to be happy, for us as a society to be able to live good lives together. Now, of course, Socrates isn't the only philosopher, and there's certainly people that will take up some of these questions in different ways. The next two modules we'll spend thinking about other aspects of Socrates' thought. We're going to see how the foundation of these views in Socrates' epistemology and metaphysics. And so things are going to definitely change pace in our next class. We're going to spend most of our time discussing the nature of time. So get excited for that. And I will encounter you in the next module. Have a beautiful week.